Welcome back to Cody Jay Uncensored, the podcast where we take a closer look at the beauty industry, peel back the layers, and dive deep into what's really going on behind the scenes. I'm your resident pro MUA and beauty expert, Cody Jay, and today we're tackling a somewhat controversial topic that has been sparking curiosity and questions across the makeup world, and that is pressed pigments. These aren't your average eyeshadows like they seem. They're bolder, they're more intense, and yes, a little controversial. Are they worth the hype? Are they safe? And why are they so popular despite the challenges they bring? Today we're covering all of this and more, so buckle up and let's dive in. So let's start with the basics. What exactly are pressed pigments? At first glance, they might look like regular eyeshadows, but don't be fooled, which is easy to happen because they literally look identical to eyeshadows, but pressed pigments are pretty much completely different. So while traditional eyeshadows are basically a balance of a blend of pigments and binders, fillers, things like that, they're designed for smooth blending and a soft wash of color. But in comparison, pressed pigments, you're basically stripping away all of those extras, and pressed pigments are essentially pure. Also, we're going to say the word pressed pigments about 812 times today. FYI. So pressed pigments are essentially just very pure, highly concentrated colorants that are just pressed really, really hard into a pan. And unfortunately, they skip most of the filler ingredients like talc and silicone that you've come to know and love in your eyeshadows, which maybe you don't realize that those are in your eyeshadows, but they are, and they are what give you that really easy blendability, that smoothness, that creaminess. But when you remove all that, that's what gives pressed pigments that extra vibrancy and intensity, that saturation. Basically, what you see in the pan is absolutely what you'll get on your skin. Whereas when you're looking at eyeshadows, a lot of the times you'll hear people say like, oh, it was so beautiful in the pan, but when I applied it, it didn't look anything like it, or it wasn't as intense. Well, that's because you're seeing all the fillers, you're seeing everything packed together, but when you start blending it out and dispersing all of that ingredient, it's gonna be much lighter and not as satisfying. But with pressed pigments, what you see is what you get. But there are trade-offs to using pressed pigments in comparison to eyeshadows. They can be much harder to work with, for example. They may feel dry or patchy compared to traditional eyeshadows. But that's why using the right tools and techniques becomes crucial to being able to utilize pressed pigments more effectively and efficiently, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now here's just a little side note, a little fun fact, if you will. So pressed pigments, people think eyeshadow immediately. They're not limited to just eyeshadows. Pressed pigments can also be used basically anywhere, so on your cheeks, your lips, or even your hair when you mix them with the right mediums. Basically, they're just used as a creative tool for makeup artists and enthusiasts. You can use them in such a variety of ways. So we're gonna go in the direction of maybe something that's not super exciting, but I feel like it's super interesting because ultimately, this is the concept that people are talking about the most when it comes to pressed pigments, and that is their regulations. So things are gonna get a little bit technical, but like, stay with me, okay? So the regulations around pressed pigments are intricate and difficult from time to time. So if you've ever bought a palette with the disclaimer that says not approved for use around the eyes or not safe for use around the eyes, that's the thing that I see everyone say. And they're like, then why the hell am I buying this? How can the brand sell it? Things like that. So basically, if you've wondered like, why would they sell it if it's not safe? The answer lies in the pigments themselves. So in the United States, at least, the FDA has very strict rules about what colorants can be used in cosmetics, especially around the eyes. So think reds, pinks, and purple eyeshadows or pressed pigments. They're often in the spotlight because some of the synthetic dyes that are used in them that are used to create those colors, they can cause irritation and most times stain the skin around your eyes. So that's why you're gonna see brands including those disclaimers that they are required to include about certain shades being pressed pigments instead of eyeshadows, because there's a much higher chance that, of course, those shadows are gonna stain or cause some slight irritation. And everyone's skin is different. Like for me, I don't get any irritation using pressed pigments and I get very little staining. There's always gonna be shades like bright reds and pinks that often stain me, but it comes right off like with an actual oil-based makeup remover. But like with my first step of my two-step cleanse, or my double cleanse, it's not gonna come off as easily. So when you see that disclaimer of like, oh, it's not safe for use around the eyes, that doesn't mean you can't use it. It's just that the brand legally has to disclose that on the palette so that you know that there's a chance for the increase of the staining and whatnot that I just mentioned. But you as a consumer have a responsibility to look into the products you're buying, and I can't stress that enough. A brand can put out these disclaimers and the information on products all they want, but you as a consumer, you as somebody that is spending your hard-earned money, need to actually do some research before you buy things. And I know you may not want to hear that, but at the end of the day, it is true, because it's no different than if you're going to buy an appliance or a television or a furniture. What are you doing? You're looking up reviews, you're looking up information about the product, all those things. It should be no different when you're buying makeup or skincare products even. You should do your due diligence to look into those products before you buy them, because if you did, then you would know what these FDA terms and regulations are when it comes to pressed pigments, and then you wouldn't worry about it and make Twitter posts being like, how dare they sell me something that I can't even use? You get my drift. Now, what's interesting and also causes a little bit of conflict with some of the conversation I'm seeing is that in other parts of the world, like the European Union, for example, many of these same exact pigments that we are either not allowed to use or have to have these disclaimers are approved for eye use in those countries and in those areas. So, and mainly it's because the different regulatory bodies between different countries that just have different criteria for their safety testing. So the rules are not universal, and that adds to a lot of confusion for people because, they won't see those disclaimers if they're buying from, like Europe, for example, but they'll see them as disclaimers if, they're buying something from America. And it's like, well, why is it okay for one but not the other? Why is it dangerous in one country but not the other? It's not necessarily that it's more dangerous. It's just that different levels of safety and testing are just, they vary from country to country. And so, of course, accordingly, the regulations change from country to country. So here's an example. So let's take carmine. I feel like carmine is the most commonly referred to ingredient when it comes to makeup products and these like regulations and pressed pigments and whatnot. So carmine is a natural red pigment. So as you may have heard, it's made from crushed insects, often beetles, and it's often used to achieve very vibrant red tones in makeup. And while it's considered safe and has been used for centuries in beauty products, many cruelty-free and vegan brands avoid it. So they're usually opting in for synthetic dyes instead so that they can maintain that label that they are cruelty-free and vegan. And again, if you're like, I'm not understanding, it's because they're crushing insects to make those pigments. So automatically, if you're using a crushed beetle or a crushed insect, you're not cruelty-free and you're not certainly vegan. But the toss-up for staying true to that vegan or cruelty-free label and not using carmine and instead using a synthetic dye is that you're more likely to stain or irritate your skin. So essentially it's just creating a trade-off between those ethical considerations and then you have the potential skin reaction. So ultimately it's up to you as the consumer, the person buying these products to, identify which part of that scenario you feels more important. So now let's talk about safety a little bit and understanding a bit more about the risks of pressed pigments. So are they safe to use? The short answer is yes, they're absolutely safe to use, but there are some caveats. So let's break it down a little bit. This is where I'm gonna get a little technical for you. So the most common concerns with pressed pigments, of course, are in regards to staining and irritation, because since they're so concentrated, those pressed pigments are very, very likely to leave behind a tint, especially on fair skin like myself or sensitive skin also like myself. So, and this is going to be especially true for, reds or purples and pinks, kind of like I talked about earlier, because those use stronger dye so that they're very vibrant. When you use a stronger dye, there's a higher chance of staining. Now, irritation can also be an issue, especially if you're someone that has sensitive skin or if you're using pigments near your waterline. So the waterline is one of the most delicate areas of your face, if you did not know. So if you're applying those intense pressed pigments in that area specifically, there's definitely a much higher chance of having, discomfort or even allergic reactions. So here are 3 tips that you can do to try and reduce the chance of any type of issue. So number 1, always do a patch test with these pressed pigments. So apply it on the back of your neck, apply it on your wrist, see if your skin has a natural reaction to it before you just go in and throw it onto a super sensitive area like around the eyes. Because if you're gonna have a reaction on your arm or your neck, you're certainly gonna have a reaction around your eyes, an area, again, that's much more sensitive and delicate. Now keep in mind, since those areas are more sensitive and delicate, there is a chance that you're not gonna have any type of reaction whatsoever or any staining on your arm, but you may have some on your eye. So it's just one of those things where it's like, it's still good to try and do that just to be safe, but there's, like with all things, a chance that, you could still have a slight issue. Step 2 is to use a good eyeshadow base, especially one that's full coverage. So what this is gonna do is create a barrier between the pigment and your skin. And you should be using one even with regular eyeshadows because it provides a lot of benefits, but we're not gonna get into that because that's not what this is about. But you should definitely use a really good full coverage eye base, especially if you're using pressed pigments. It's gonna sit on top of that base rather than sitting on top of your skin. So it's definitely gonna reduce, for sure, gonna reduce the amount of staining, if you have any, that you'll have. And it's also gonna help to reduce the chance of having irritation because it's not directly technically touching your skin. And again, there's a chance that it could have an issue because that's how life is. And tip number 3 is just to flat out avoid using pressed pigments on your waterline completely. If you don't even want to risk the chance of having irritation or any types of problems, just don't use it on your waterline. Now, another just kind of side note when it comes to concerns with pressed pigments is the definitely noticeable increase in fallout. So it's the little bits of flecks of pigment that you end up getting on your cheeks that literally quote falls out, hence the name fallout, onto your face when you're doing your makeup. And obviously it's very frustrating and annoying because it can literally ruin your makeup, because if it was a regular eyeshadow, you just can like brush it away pretty easily and then cover it back up with a little bit of foundation. If it's a pressed pigment and it's going to stain your skin, good luck. It's gonna be harder to cover up, it's gonna be harder to remove, and it's just very, very aggravating. So when you're applying, it's best to use a damp brush or pack the pigment really, really, really well into a sticky base. That's gonna help minimize fallout, but I just wanted to mention that for a hot second. But even though there's all these concerns, if you will, let's talk about why we love pressed pigments anyway. If you're an artist that loves intense or editorial style makeup looks, pressed pigments have got you covered. These are much longer lasting and much more intense, saturated, vibrant, all the things compared to traditional eyeshadows. And they're just, if you want something that's super bold, you're most times gonna go in with a pressed pigment. It's just faster and it accomplishes what you're looking for or looking to do much easier. Don't get me wrong, you can still use traditional eyeshadows and build up the intensity and the saturation of the shadow and ultimately achieve your goal. It's just gonna take a little bit more work. So another benefit to using pressed pigments compared to traditional eyeshadows is how versatile they are. And I kind of briefly mentioned that earlier. So you're not just limited to your eyelids, like I said. You can use a little bit of mixing medium and you can turn those pressed pigments into eyeliner or lipstick or temporary hair dye if you want to kind of be a little over the top and extra, which I love being over the top and extra. So let's kind of get a little bit more granular when it comes to some of the common worries about pressed pigments. So first and foremost, are they safe for sensitive skin? This is probably the number one concern that people have. So at the end of the day, many pressed pigments do contain higher concentrations of those colorants that we talked about earlier, which can ultimately be more likely to irritate your sensitive skin or eyes. So if you're someone that's prone to, let's say, redness or itching, allergic reactions, things of that nature, some of the ingredients in pressed pigments like the synthetic dyes or even the natural ones like the carmine, they can trigger those issues a lot more likely than traditional eyeshadow. So it might just be best to just flat out not use them at all. Again, something that I mentioned earlier is you can try to do a patch test before actually applying those products directly to your eyes. So just put a little bit, again, like I said, on your forearm or behind your ear, and you're supposed to wait 24 hours. Like when I was in cosmetology school, it was the same thing when it came to hair dyes. You would do a patch test, but I've always thought how many people are actually walking around with, a product sitting on the back of their neck for 24 hours? It's not practical, but technically it's something that you can do. Now, another big worry is whether or not pressed pigments will stain your skin. So if you've ever applied a bright pink or a red eyeshadow, and obviously you notice that your eyelids looked a little pink the next day, well, you're not alone. We all go through it. Even with a good base, we all go through it. Staining basically is happening because the pigments are so concentrated. So some of the synthetic dyes like FD&C Red 40 are notorious for leaving behind that tint, especially on those of us who have fair to light skin. Staining isn't harmful, but it's obviously annoying, and it just, you're walking around and your eyelids are all pink or whatever, and people are like, bro, what's wrong with you? But like I mentioned earlier, using a really good full coverage eyeshadow base can help to eliminate the chance of staining or how much stain actually happens. Also, pro tip, using an oil-based makeup remover is really effective at removing those stains and breaking down those stains. So if you're having trouble and you're not using an oil-based makeup remover, try that and thank me later. Now, another issue people have are, whether or not pressed pigments are ethically sourced. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the red pigments come from carmine, which is a natural dye that's derived from crushed insects, which is kind of gross to think about, but so for people who only use cruelty-free or vegan products, you cannot use most of these pressed pigments, especially the red ones. But like I mentioned earlier, there are synthetic alternatives to carmine like red number 40, and it is vegan, but again, it does have environmental drawbacks since they're derived from petroleum-based ingredients. So again, this is basically just meant to highlight more of a broad issue in cosmetics because there's almost always going to be a trade-off between ethical production of ingredients or products and environmental sustainability. It usually clashes. So basically my advice to you is do your research on brands, products, ingredients, etc., and make decisions based on your values because everyone's values differ from person to person. Some people prioritize one thing over another and others it's the reverse. So you can look on their websites, you can I'm sure reach out and get more information about ingredients or the products themselves from brands if you ask. Ultimately, no one can make the decision for what kind of products you use other than yourself. Again, to recap a little bit on whether or not pressed pigments can actually harm your eyes. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but it is worth diving into a little bit deeper. So some pigments, especially those that are in red or purple shades, aren't FDA approved for use around the eyes in the United States. This doesn't mean that they're automatically just outright unsafe. It just means that the FDA has not conducted sufficient testing to make sure whether or not those ingredients are safe for being around the delicate eye areas. So it's just important to note that this is mostly a regulatory issue, not a product issue or a safety issue. So in countries like Europe and other regions, these same pigments, like I mentioned before, may be approved for eye use, but are not approved for eye use, technically speaking, in the United States, at least without that disclosure. So if you're someone that's experiencing redness or irritation, your eyes are tearing up a lot and you're using these pressed pigments, just stop using them. At the end of the day, just stop using them because you can still, like I said, ultimately accomplish whatever goal you're trying to accomplish with makeup, by using traditional eyeshadows or products that are safer. Just, you might as well just not even use them. Now, something I've been asked before in the past is, whether or not pressed pigments are, should they be used for beginners? Like, are they harder to use? And I would say yes. I feel like a lot of times beginner makeup enthusiasts have a lot more trouble using pressed pigments, and that's totally fine. Their payoff is very intense and it can be overwhelming and harder to blend out and harder to manage. So compared to like traditional eyeshadows, it's very easy to over apply them and then it's harder to blend them out and it just becomes a mess. So if you're new to makeup or just starting out with pressed pigments, here's my advice. Go slow. Start off with a very small amount of product and build it up gradually. Don't go in for like the big shebang right off the bat, because it's much easier to add more product and more intensity compared to trying to take it down or tone it down. Now, I know the topic of pressed pigments is more on the boring side, maybe. I don't know, a bit more technical, a bit more just surrounding the legalities of the ingredients or the products themselves. But I do feel like it's so applicable to what I do as a professional makeup artist and a beauty expert, because so many people just don't understand why, like I mentioned earlier, why pressed pigments have that FDA disclosure about not being safe around, sensitive skin or around your eyes. So I just really wanted to talk about this just to inform people more than anything that, maybe the fear or like you don't have to be as fearful. And I just wanted you to be able to understand the actual legalities around pressed pigments. And, if you're someone that is vegan and cruelty-free conscious, like how pressed pigments can affect that whole, ethical concern that you may have. So I just really thought it was important to touch on these topics surrounding pressed pigments, because I feel like not a lot of people talk about them. And then sometimes the ones who are just not correct. And I like to put out proper information. So I hope that I was able to address some of the concerns that maybe you yourself listening to this have had when it comes to pressed pigments. And like any beauty product, they come with pros and cons, and with the right knowledge, which hopefully you got from today's video, you can use them safely and effectively and just not have as much worry around them. But with all of that being said, thank you so much for tuning into Cody Jay Uncensored. If you recently discovered pressed pigments and maybe have been a little hesitant on using them, I hope today's episode helped you. Until next time, stay curious, stay beautiful, and don't let anyone censor you.